Hi, this is Paul. Probably most of you are aware of this. Well, some of you are aware of this YouTube channel called Dark Matter 2525. Dark Matter 2525 has mostly had a lot of sort of new atheist style, new atheist style Christian videos. And what was interesting about the video that came across my feed, which is better, left wing, right wing, are new political religions, is that it is beginning to dawn even on some of the most hardcore new atheists. Of course, this dawned on people like Peter Boghossian a couple of years ago, that their framework and their definition of religion is obsolete and passé, and it just doesn't really work anymore. And so I had never seen his face. I think a lot of his older videos had sort of like little graphics here and there, and I don't know when he started bringing his face into it. I don't watch him all that often, but it was very interesting having him sort of walk through the American left and right and how early in the video, let's see, I'm at 53:10 because I wanted to keep that spot. Early in the video, he just basically went through these different political groups, and he noted that if someone sort of embraced one of these, they would embrace the whole stack, and you could sort of predict how people would feel based on their whole stack, and people's allegiances to these things were pretty set. He then took on the political heat map, which is something that Glenn Scribner had done, and he basically says, well, this doesn't really show, because he's sort of approaching it from a left, more of a left wing point of view, and then he goes to persuasive methods, and forced into a religion, and he notes that people's commitments to these ideas seem religious in nature. And whereas before religion was always sort of tagged as metaphysical beliefs or things attached to Iron Age books, that now suddenly even the new atheists are, their definition of religion, most of them, we still have T-Grog around, but most of them have sort of come to the realization that the reason new atheism is sort of going away is that it just doesn't describe the mapping right now with respect to people in terms of what people believe really matters. In some ways, it made a similar point to this article that I found a few days ago, the death spiral of progressive Christianity, why the mainline is in crisis. And he basically talked about the fact that mainline churches are recognizing that, well, they have these buildings, and they have the staff, and they have this worship, and why don't they just sell the buildings, quit the staff, quit the Sunday worship, quit the liturgy, quit all of those things, and just give their money to Planned Parenthood or Habitat for Humanity or the local food bank or something like this, because isn't that all that Christianity is about? So Peugeot makes the Antichrist point in his Patreon video, where basically the ointment given for Jesus' feet, where Judas says, "Oh, this should have been sold and given to the poor," and Jesus says, "No, it is right that it is given for me as an anointing for my death." And of course, Jonathan Peugeot, I want to talk a lot more about James Orr in this video. James Orr has had a whole bunch of things. He's sort of surfacing right now as an important player in this. He's been, Dreer did a blog about him recently. Jonathan Peugeot just had a conversation with him. Elizabeth Oldfield had a really good conversation with him. But this point here
of encountering scripture, never mind all the kind of arguments about civilization and, oh, it's so useful for society.
They're talking about Kingsnorth's talk.
It's so useful for holding the family together and so on. Kierkegaard is also a good person to read on this. His great critique of the kind of cultural complacency of Copenhagen Christianity, you know, of just that we're missing something here. We're missing the kind of the raw power of contact with Christ, of a relationship with Christ. So I think what Paul is, I think it's an important contribution. I know it's ruffled a few feathers and it's kind of discombobulated people.
Yeah, well, it's okay, you know, and I think that, and so, like you said, I think we have to enter into the conversation. I had to record a conversation with him about it, which probably should be out by the time we put this out. And I think that the critique is absolutely right, you know. But it's difficult. In some ways it's an image of the difficulty of all good things, because you're right that it does offer. It does offer so much in terms of our civilization. It is the foundation of so many good things. But we always have to keep things in the right order, right? If you want the higher good for the lower goods, then it never works. It never functions. You cannot make, you know, the worship of God a utility for the stability of your family or for your civilization, although it will yield that. And so it's hard even in our own hearts to keep the order properly, because we do want all these things. Like, we do want our societies to function. We do want our families to hold together, and that it's also okay to want that. And so it's hard to order that. I feel it in myself. Like, it's hard to order things properly in my heart, knowing that if I'm a Christian, a faithful Christian, that it will have fruit that won't just be, you know, for my faith, you know.
Yeah. I mean, you spoke brilliantly at the ARC conference here in London. What was it, last year? And I remember in that conference, that electric panel with Os Guinness and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and which I think for the first time she announced her.
It was the first time she announced. Yeah, that's
the
right.
First time we were all, and we had no idea that that was coming. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't planned. But I know she got a bit of blowback, unfairly, I thought, for instrumentalizing Christianity, or saying, you know, trying to frame her conversion in the context of a need to defend a civilization that she'd fallen in love with and that she'd seen to be the best hope for humanity. And I don't, you know, my sense is whatever route to God one takes is great if it's a route that gets you to God.
That's right. That's also true.
You know, sometimes you need instruments. Well, you always need instruments to do stuff, and you know, people take all kinds of different paths to the divine. But there was something. I
want to say something on what you're saying, because I think that it's really important, because when you think about, for example, someone who becomes an alcoholic and, you know, falls into the worst parts of their life and, you know, hits rock bottom, and then turns to God, you could say, well, there's something instrumental about that as well, where you want God because you're suffering, and therefore you hope that God will answer your suffering. And so you have to have sympathy, like you said, for people who are dealing with the meaning crisis, both personally and civilizationally, to see that, it is, God will provide a solution to these problems, although we have to be careful not to make that the final end, because you know, then it doesn't function.
Yeah.
And I think that's when you sort of check out this dark matter video. It's very interesting. He gets to the end. There are a number of comments in the video where one person said, "I like dark matter very much, but as a Brit, I find the idea that American Democrats are left-wing patently absurd." That produces a lot of comments. Oh, he's smart enough to know that, and he's talking to an American audience, blah, 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 blah. The difficulty, of course, is that the idea all along has been, you don't really need, as Peugeot says, you don't really need the top. You don't need the God desiring, and you don't need the liturgy and the worship, and you don't need all of those things in order to have, well, the payoffs of what people want. Let's say in the case of the alcoholic, the sobriety; in the case of the person with a specific set of desired outcomes, the motivation. At one of the estuary meetings, you know, someone basically articulated the the idea that, well, why can't we make people more generous towards their neighbors? And the problem is sort of a motivational posture. And if we could sort of give people the motivation to be more generous towards their neighbors, then we wouldn't need the supernatural stuff like the God stuff. And of course, you can find plenty of people who are generous towards their neighbors, but there's a sense that this entire edifice is something beyond us. It's not anywhere near so instrumental and direct. I remember in the 80s, there was a big movement in the United States where they were going to teach morals without religion in the public schools, because once you would say God or the Bible or any of these things, you'd get in trouble with secularity. And so then we're just going to achieve a situation where, well, where what? What is the motivation for people to practice voluntary self-sacrifice? As Jordan Peterson says again and again and again, voluntary self-sacrifice. Tim Keller really, I think, engaged this quite well in the 90s and aughts when he talked about the fact that most people try to employ pride as a motivational tool. You want to be a good person, don't you? Well, good people are generous and selfless in their actions. The difficulty with this motivational structure, however, is that, well, is it better to be seen as a good person in the eyes of your peers, or to actually get what you want in terms of money, sex, and power? And reputation is a fine thing, but what that usually sort of sets up with people is a kind of duplicity where in front of people they'll act generous and kind and have all of these values that have sort of come to rise in the West as the good values, but in private they certainly won't practice them, because what they're really after are the satisfaction of their whims. And this is sort of where Jordan Peterson's current preachings are sort of getting at, because he wants to talk about the fact that voluntary self-sacrifice is both sort of the core of the individual in terms of a definition of maturity, and the core of a society in terms of the definition of a society that we want. And one of the things that you note with both these lists that he has of the right and the left, that there are Christian values sort of strewn throughout them. As he gets towards the ends about persuasive values, he says some of this.
Holding the status quo by not supporting the policy. Appeal to their desire to change things. Give them an optimistic vision of the future rather than appealing to an idealistic version of the past.
So basically what he's saying is that, well, the left is motivated by eschatology. They're motivated by the idea that in the future, it's, again, a negative utilitarianism. In the future, there won't be suffering. In the future, there will be equality. In the future, all of this. So use this sort of eschatological motivation in order to propel them somewhere. Whereas you would say, well, on the right, you sort of have, while the left is sort of future looking in terms of their progressivism, the right is sort of past looking in terms of they want to arise and be like great civilizations in the past. But again, as Tim Keller's critique went, both of these are sort of motivated by pride, by desire for, the old language would be vainglory, glorification of the self. And one of the things that Tim Keller, I think, did very effectively in his preaching was turn that around and note that you can't really use these mechanisms with people, because actually they need to be inspired by far higher things such as beauty and gratitude. And religion tends to do this via the stories that it employs. It's the beauty that they see, let's say, in Christ's self-donation that inspires the person to arise to become like Christ. It's the gratitude in seeing Christ's sacrifice on our behalf that motivates us. Misery, deliverance, gratitude. That's why I always use them in my sermons. that motivates us to give ourselves out of gratitude. And so, in other words, part of what the religions had the capacity to do was to inspire beyond sort of the normal motivational structures of vainglory, wanting to have good reputation in the eyes of others, which sort of encourages us towards hypocrisy, towards making a show out in public, whereas in private we're sort of seething with all sorts of darker, deeper desires. I'm going to act generous in public so that I get the reputation that I want, so that people will love me, so that I will get the money, power, and the other gratifications that I really need. In other words, and of course the Puritans and many religious Christian societies have worked on this. You have to somehow address this motivational structure, and people are not so simple as, let's say, the marshmallow test really works well with small children, but as we grow in complexity, sometimes duplicity, the marshmallow test really isn't sufficient. We've come to a very interesting place in American politics. And Mary Harrington wrote a piece today called "You Can't Make Me." And I tweeted this out. Mary Harrington puts her finger on what has been true for a long time, but the kayfabe of American post-war liberalism has been basically Americans saying, imperialist? Who, us? We're just the world's benefactors. And Caesar Augustus wouldn't say better. One couldn't have said it better, because that's, of course, Caesar Augustus's stick. Oh, I'm not the emperor. I'm the first citizen, and I'm just doing what I can and using my personal wealth, that is basically the entirety of the Roman Empire, to benefit the Roman Empire. Now, I know some people doubt this, and especially I'm sure that there are plenty of people around the world that would say, Americans don't really believe that about themselves. And I would say, oh no, I think we really do. And this is part of this really interesting dynamic that has happened in American culture, because the left, especially since the counterculture and the Vietnam War, was always the first to come in and sort of down talk America. But there was always sort of a humble pride in that down talking of America. They were the first to sort of expose the fact that America has an imperialist role in Latin America through a lot of the 20th century. And many of America's wars had a degree of, it wasn't pure altruism that we were moving with. There were things that we wanted. Now, this sets up a really interesting dynamic. What's happening now is that Trump's decisions to nakedly use power is a strange sign of weakness. The truly powerful can maintain the fig leaf of doing the will of the people or the common good, while the underclass keeps the truth as an open secret. The bloom is off the boomer rose as the Pax Americana comes to an end. Europe is asked to shake off a childish senility, but can it? Mary starts with the example of a toddler in the bath, and she says to her toddler, "It's bath time," and the toddler says, "You can't make me." And Mary Harrington says, "Well, basically, I actually can." And again, this is common toddler parenting. And then once you put her in the tub, she's perfectly happy in the tub and she's glad to have it. But the toddler's just sort of trying out rebellion. And Mary Harrington basically makes the point that Europe has been living on the back of American militarism for a very long time now. And so it's taking on this whole thing about the rules-based international order. Nowhere is this more visible than the would-be empire of the rules, the European Union, whose collective mind is illustrated by the tale one maritime expert recounted to me about a discussion he had on reopening European shipyards with an official of the European Commission. The official told him with a merry laugh that there's no need to do this because the way the world works now is that America finances everything, China makes everything, and Europe sets the rules. In turn, the EU is only the rulesiest bit of a much bigger empire of rules, the so-called rules-based international order. And what I find bewildering in contemporary discussions is the way it seems as though this bath time question simply needn't be asked or somehow assumed already answered. That it is, if a polity or a group of polities set rules, only for someone to say, you can't make me, whose job is to say, well, actually, I can. And Trump basically comes in and says, we're no longer willing to play by those rules, and we're no longer willing to fulfill the role that we had played. And so, well, what are you going to do now? The rules-based international order is only underwritten by a structural level by American hard power. But it was in fact always the moralistic gloss of the fundamentally imperial internationalist project with universal ambitions. In this telling, one echoed by some on the radical left, with further variations among America's enemies in other parts of the world, the real victor of the World War II wasn't peace or the good guys or even the Allies. It was the covertly imperialist U.S.-led regime that aspired to one world government. And, just hasn't really been able to pull it off lately. Yarvin cites Wendell Willkie, an American lawyer and one-time presidential hopeful, whose reporting on his travel around European empires during the Second World War played a crucial role in shaping the post-war American pivot from relative isolationism towards a more internationalist stance that has characterized its foreign policy from that period all the way to Trump. One World, written in 1943, argued that the aim of the war wasn't just to defeat the Nazis, but to liberate the world in general. Specifically, are the 31 United Nations fighting together already that our common job of liberation, that's a super important word because liberation sort of had a theological valence as well, giving to all people the freedom to govern themselves as soon as they are able, and the economic freedom on which all lasting self-government inevitably rests. Okay, so you've got, well, it's the economy, stupid, and on top of economy, liberty. In plain English, what we meant was dismantling the European empires. In other words, to have one sort of lion in fox clothing that can conquer the world. And so, of course, when Saddam Hussein steps out of bounds and takes Kuwait, America comes in and says, oh, no, this is not what we do anymore. You'd better get back over the line or we're going to put you back over the line. Willkie argued that in the name of world peace, this dismantling should be accompanied by a neutering of the European states themselves on their home territory. The recreation of the small countries of Europe as political units, yes. Their recreation as economic and military units, no. If we really hope to bring stabilization to the Western Europe, both for its own benefit and the peace and safety of the world. The telos was, per the title of Willkie's own book, One World, in theory, a neutral, global, and universal, but tacitly, in practice, American. Above all, there was no other world powers. The Monroe Doctrine was now revealed in its full glory, both a doctrine of world conquest and a doctrine of world anarchy. And in its insistence and its own ideological monopoly, it reminds us more and more every day of the Brezhnev Doctrine. Every day we see more and more of the hard bones underneath the velvet flesh of soft power. Freedom means there is no power but us. European sovereignty over Europe had come to an end. All sovereignty, therefore, had to end. Even the logic of domestic cultural politics had to be subjugated by global soft power. In the end, war and trade were not exceptions. Democracy was not an exception. Every kind of local or distinctive power had to be suffocated. And, of course, for a while, the Soviet Union sort of stood against that. After the fall of the Soviet Union, China sort of played along, but you get a sense that, well, China was really sort of playing its own game, and when it steps away from that, well, now things go in another direction. We'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony, and the way we do that is making sure that they sing, and of course, a la Brave New World rather than 1984, have enough in it so that people willingly go along. But then, of course, this has sort of come to an end. Now, Glenn Scrivener, in his defining moment of ARC 2025, where he talked about the David Brooks talk, had a really important little section in here about sort of how evangelicals, I think, again, a little different for European evangelicals like Scrivener, although he's Australian, evangelicals sort of played a different way in this. This piece of this video really stuck in me.
A massive sign, and it'll just say, stop talking about biblical values and read the darn thing. And I would say the great majority of those who are in attendance are Christians of one stripe or another. And so if it turned out that somebody wasn't, I was like, what's it like being surrounded by all these Christians? And then I would explain, I am one, by the way, just before you say anything too horrible about Christians.
Because Glenn Scrivener, unlike Reverend Dan and a good number of other C of E people, wasn't wearing a clerical collar.
And we would get into deep, rich conversations about, you know what, I started reading Job. That's what one guy, he wasn't even a Christian, and yet on his business card, he was a writer, on his business card, he had Proverbs written, like he had a proverb, like with the Bible reference underneath it, as he gave it to me. And he's been like really deeply impacted by Jordan Peterson, wanting to read the scriptures more. And so we get into this conversation, and by the end of it, I give away one book. And like the very next person I talk to, another very deep conversation about Jesus. The next person, a very deep conversation about Jesus. I was done with all these, but I've now got to go and post. I've got to go and post another couple of books to people afterwards. I just didn't bring enough evangelistic literature with me, which means next ARC, I wonder if, I don't know if I'll pay for a ticket, but I might pay for a stand and go into the exhibition hall. And I think what I'll have is just a massive sign, and it'll just say, stop talking about biblical values and read the darn thing. And I'll just hand out Bibles to people. I think that might be incredibly fruitful. And like, how does that strike you, if you're a Christian, how does that strike you that there is an incredibly fruitful mission field on the right of things? Because I'm one of the good people. I've always been one of the good people. I went to the right college at the right university with impeccable kind of liberal credentials. And I've always been used to being that kind of person. And I do evangelism sometimes on university campuses, in which generally, through the 2000s and the 2010s, the tactic has always been to say, Jesus is also an environmentalist, so become a Christian. Jesus is also a feminist,
So this, if you looked at Tim Keller and what Tim Keller did in New York City, Tim Keller, when he would explain what he would do, his evangelistic method, which was very effective in terms of his preaching in New York City, he would basically say, so you have these values that you want. Well, Jesus can do it better for you. You're no longer going to be motivated out of vainglory, my reputation, how others see me. You're no longer going to be motivated by those things, because if pride is at the heart of your motivation to be good, pride will betray you. It's sort of the logic of Tolkien's ring. In fact, you need a deeper, stronger strength to actually be self-donating and self-sacrificing, which is what everyone in the culture looks at as inspired by. But how can we actually do it, and not just do it in public to show? And of course, Jesus talks about this quite a bit with respect to hypocrisy comes into the common vocabulary in many ways because of Jesus. And Jesus says, no. Of course, it was in the Bible before, because Daniel, even though there's a rule against prayer, praying to anyone else but the king in the book of Daniel, well, Daniel goes in and he continues to pray by himself. And that, of course, gets him thrown into the lion's den.
Become a Christian. And a lot of apologetics has always been left coded while I've been an evangelist. I guess I've worked full-time for churches for the last 25 years, and officially as an evangelist, with evangelist on my business card since 2010. So
now this is a little bit different in America than it is in the UK. I think what he's saying here is true of the UK, was definitely true of Tim Keller's New York City. When Tim Keller listened to Aaron Renn about positive, neutral, and negative world, Tim Keller's answer was, I've been living in the negative world a long time, but living in New York City. Aaron Renn sort of modulates that, nuances a little bit, but for someone like Glenn Scrivener, I've got to make Jesus intelligible to the left. And because, again, a la the Tom Holland thesis, there's plenty to work with in the left in terms of the liberationism that Jesus brings. And we just talked about this liberationist ethos that was out there in politics. And again, this sort of flows out of the lion culture of the broad Protestant WASP civil religion that dominated America and then instilled Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt and the Charter of the United Nations. And that's sort of the religious foundation for this one world order that Mary Harrington was talking about. And in fact, the religious motivation beneath the left of LGBTQ liberation, all of these things. I spoke with one person at the conference, and that part of how you can understand that the conversations today with respect to religion is that it's sort of liberationism versus rigor. And they're not completely separate, because often you will hear people on the liberationist side asking for rigor. And so when a mainline church decides that the worship service and the cathedral and the staff and all of these things which are costing money that could be used for building houses for the poor, giving food for the poor, for abortion services for the poor, and all of these things, well, let's get rid of these things. Let's sell this woman's ointment and give the money to the poor, according to exactly what Judas says. And that's part of sort of the rigorous liberationism. And there's also a liberationist rigor that is at play. People will say, okay, I'm now, a bunch of people now that Lent has started, a bunch of people have sort of signed off Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, and we're not going to see them for the next 40 days. Some people have sort of been off these things with Exodus 90. And so they have sort of rigorous liberationist rigor. I am free from social media. I am free from the cares of the world. I am free from my desires. And so liberation and rigor aren't exactly opposed to each other, and often they sort of work together, but you can find both rigor and liberationist themes in the gospel of Jesus. And so if you're handing out Bibles like Glenn Scrivener, people on the right and the left are both going to find some of the things that they want to in that. But of course, the question that Jonathan Peugeot and James Orr are wrestling with, a la the King's North talk, is how does this actually get deployed? How do I actually live into this thing? And of course, religion for a very long time has been, most people that don't know a lot about religion sort of reduce religion to a bunch of rules. And while there certainly are rules, and rules can be very handy things, religion is never just simply about a bunch of rules, because rules always break down into nuance, because you cannot sort of figure out how to live in the world by a whole set of rules. This is, again, a part of the Jordan Peterson, John Vervaeke observations with respect to AI, cognitive science, and all of this. And this broke down partly because philosophers and scientists began to realize, when they were trying to create machines that could make their way through a cornfield, that a rules-based system didn't really work, and hence you had machine learning, and now the machines are going to learn, and that's in fact how you need to deal with a combinatorially explosive world.
I've done a lot of this stuff, and a lot of it is left-coded, which is great. I mean, that's where I'm from, and that's kind of the political home that I've always felt most at home in, and I guess anyone who is my age has always swum in those sorts of waters. And now there's a vibe shift happening, and this current vibe shift is very much a reaction to the previous vibe shift, because I would say that ever since gay marriage came in on either side of the Atlantic, from that moment onwards, I think there's been a sense of you're on the right side of history if you take these social and cultural views. And in that setting, the apologetics talk, Jesus is also a feminist, just met much stronger opposition. Jesus is also an environmentalist, met much stronger opposition when the vibe was in that direction. Now, I fundamentally believe you do not have equal rights for male and female without Christianity. I've written a whole book about it. It's called The Air We Breathe, and how equality and compassion and many other of our values have come from the Jesus Revolution. I also think you don't get proper environmental concern without the Jesus Revolution. We can get into that. But the vibe shift meant that such left-coded evangelism, which was very well-meaning, fell on a lot of deaf ears. And the more recent vibe shift means that the kind of evangelism that I think resonates today would be, let's get Louise Perry to talk about, yes, Christianity and feminism, but also gender and identity and sex and the sexual revolution. And she has gone on a journey from left, and I guess most people would identify her on the right, writing for the Telegraph and the Daily Mail and people like that. But she gives a robust critique of the sexual revolution. And I'm not saying that that's a universally popular view now. Not saying that at all. But it is at least a fruitful minority, a creative minority in the midst of a culture. And those who are seeking truth beneath the vibes are the sort of people who will actually read The Case Against the Sexual Revolution by Louise Perry. And they won't mind that, if I read Louise Perry, she also writes for the Telegraph. Therefore, I am in the orbit of the basket of deplorables. Vibes actually matter in terms of whether people will give themselves to certain causes, whether they'll give themselves to investigating truths. And this
is where got to find out. There he is. The dark matter. The dark matter. This is where the dark matter dude comes in, because so many of the new atheists, of course, were using the same left coding, but the left coding, if you listen to someone like Peter Boghossian or James Lindsay, the left coding just hits this wall, and they said, well, it just dropped off rationality. And so then you get this whole IDW track where people who had been very left-coded are now sort of over on the right, even though Brett Weinstein, are they really on the right? Are they really on the left? And part of what has happened, of course, is that this whole left-right business, it is so increasingly meaningless, because at this time of disruption and turmoil, everything is sort of scrambled. I was working on a long tweet thread, which someone came by and I had to help him for a few hours with something. People would be... My life is so strange in that I'll be thinking through all of these things and trying to get my mind around them and trying to make sense of the world. And then I have to spend 3 or 4 years helping someone with what to almost everyone else in the world is a fairly simple task, but for one reason or another, they struggle with it. And that's just kind of what pastors' lives are like. So, used to be that people who were sort of left-coded in America were the secularists. And I think, Glenn is talking about the UK, and I think in the United States, the dynamics, you can sort of map them onto Europe, but they're quite a bit different, quite a bit more conservative, because this American hard power that backed sort of the one world government, which the aspiring one world government, which is now sort of collapsing, was based on a much more religious core, because America could send soldiers that would give their life for Europe, while many Europeans weren't ready to give their lives for their country. This was Rod Dreher quoting again from Mary Harrington, in that just last month, the Times reported suggests that only 11% of Gen Z's English would be willing to fight for Britain, which they aren't proud of and think is racist. The published report didn't break these down into interviewees' ethnicity, so there's no way of knowing, if anything, to the imputation made by John the Cockney. But when Rishi Sunak floated mandatory conscription for 18-year-olds just before the last election, Vox Pop interviews suggested that many young people rejected the idea of the British military service out of hand, and in some cases cited immigrant heritage as a grounds for refusal. And then you basically go around Europe and discover that many Europeans are not willing to fight for their nation because they don't really have a nation, because sort of the one world government, or the aspiring one world government, was kind of their thing, and what to do with that? I came across this video, didn't know anything about the channel. There are a few interviews from people at ARC, the new Humanum. And so James Orr was on this too. And the whole video, it's only about 35 minutes. There's a lot of interesting stuff in it, but I'll just grab this section.
You know, I think, you know, for someone of my persuasion, I've been a Catholic all my life, and I see the deterioration in our society, as I would see it, as having much to do with the fact that so many people have drifted away from a belief in God and a worship of God. And it seems to me that the restoration of the sort of societies that most people here would wish to see, that can only be achieved, actually, by a rediscovery on a personal level by millions of our fellow citizens of this question of a belief in a deity.
I couldn't agree more. And yet one could preserve agnosticism on the God question and still observe that as a piece of social technology, Christianity has been simply extraordinary. And religion more generally has extraordinary social benefits that vastly outweigh its social costs as a coordinating mechanism for large societies at scale, as it were, imposing or generating a sort of a moral universe of manners, of etiquettes, of conventions, of interpersonal conduct, that the state therefore does not need to come in and police and introduce rules and regulations and so on. The trust that it generates among societies and between strangers within a society, and indeed and as Vance explained a few weeks ago, to other societies as well, though I think he was right to say that duties, as it were, diminish with distance. So I think it's, no story about the diagnosis of what's gotten wrong in Western civilization and the solution to how to put it right can really be silent on the God question. The question, and I think we're already seeing the waning of the atheism that was so rampant even 20 years ago. Even here at the first meeting of ARC, that astonishing moment where Ayaan Hirsi Ali so movingly, and I think unexpectedly, none of us had any idea she was going to say this, and said, I've come to the view that without Christianity at its center, our civilization will disintegrate.
Yes, it was a real moment.
An extraordinary moment.
A real moment.
And in fact, I was sad to see that actually she got a bit of criticism for that from Christians who say, well, come on, you've got to believe in it. It can't just be a useful add-on just because we want civilization to flourish. I can understand that point, and I get a bit fed up with cultural Christians who will be, say, oh, I'm a flying buttress on the church, supporting it from the outside, and say, well, that's all well and good, but frankly, those buildings are not going to stay up without pillars on the inside, and we could do with your help. Now, I think it was unfair to say that of Ayaan herself, because it's clear that she's also gone alongside that. There's been an existential renewal within her own life.
She's undergone a personal conversion herself.
But I think simply didn't think it was appropriate in that context of Os Guinness's discussion of the civilizational moment and the importance of remembering the roots of God leading to the fruits of civilization, that you can't have the fruits without the roots. And that was the context in which she very movingly, opened up about that. And it's not just her, but I think there's a number of, I don't think we're seeing any kind of nationwide revival exactly.
No.
Perhaps that doesn't matter. Maybe the iron law of oligarchy is true. Maybe that complex societies at scale are in the end always run by a relatively small, well-networked, high-trust cabal of people at the top. And, you're always going to have an elite. You might as well just try and make sure you've got the best possible elite you've got. And I think within that emerging counter-elite that you might say that this art project is doing so much to catalyze, you are starting to see a much more serious appreciation of the legacy of Christianity and the legacy of belief in God and the enormous civilizational risks of forgetting it.
I must say I took some comfort from Archbishop Angelou's remarks about how the church has, in a sense, throughout its history, always been, as it were, a pilgrim church, a persecuted church, and that we shouldn't see a moment of adversity as necessarily, or at least we should not despair in the face of adversity and the forces ranged against us as Christians. You know, that actually this is what it is to be a Christian. Is that not right?
I think that's right. I mean, there's nothing worse for a civilization, you might say, than affluence and comfort. And if you look at those moments over the last 2,000 years when Christian civilization has sort of accelerated at extraordinary rates, it's in those periods of enormous adversity. You think of the horrific persecutions of the early Christians in the mid-3rd century and then at the beginning of the 3rd century, terrible ones in 301, 302, 303. By 312, within a decade, Christianity has a foothold within the Roman pantheon. And by the end of the century, the entirety of the Roman Empire is Christianized. And you see this pattern again and again. Even think of the Reformation and the wars of religion, so-called wars of religion, wrongly called wars of religion. You know, by the mid-17th century, after terrible bloodshed, of course, and terrible horror, and staring into the civilizational abyss, the Enlightenment takes off immediately afterwards. From 1650 to 1850 is really the age in which we saw civilizational renewal and excellence on a scale that we had never witnessed before. So that's a message of, I suppose, encouragement to us all, that twilight may be upon us, but dawn's around the corner.
Let me ask you a final question. So this event is, I suppose it's fair to say it's inchoate in a way, that it's not clear exactly what's going to emerge.
It was really interesting to see just how widespread the inchoate nature of the event was, and I'm by no means the only person to make that observation.
Right, but from your perspective, what would progress in a cultural and societal sense look like in the next decade? What does progress mean to a conservative?
I think the progress is a word that tends to make conservatives come out in a rash. It certainly makes me come out in a rash, because by progress, it's normally meant capital P progress. And I think the world would progress an awful lot more if fewer people were trying to bring that kind of progress about. And normally, that sort of, I think, progressivism has tended to usher in discord, disunity, lower levels of trust, and civilizational and social fracture.
So does that mean we can't use the word at all as conservatives?
I think one has to be. Well, there's a lot of debate about this, and can one build can one sort of build one's own house with the tools of one's enemies? And the trouble with the left is they're very good at coining the best words. You know, who could be against progress? Who could be against equality? Who could be against diversity, or whatever? And that is, it's very, very tempting. I remember Roger Scruton once saying to me, I see all these wonderful words on placards in the streets, and I sometimes wonder what I'd put on my own placard. Hesitate. Have a cup of tea first. Civilizations are much easier to tear down than they are to build up organically over time.
So there is this sort of struggle.
Yes.
However, there's been an interesting little turn in right-wing discourse online. And I mentioned this actually in a speech I gave in Washington back in July, just after the vice president's event, or then vice president-elect. I said, look, we need to think about what right-wing progressivism looks like. And not everyone here is going to think of themselves as right-wing. I do, happily. I'm interested in progress. I'm interested in what lower P progress means.
Yes.
And I'll give you a little example of what I had in mind. The other day I was passing through St Pancras on my way down from Cambridge. And it struck me, I never really stopped to look at it, what an extraordinary building St Pancras Station is in London. And I read into the history of it, and it turns out it was deliberately built on the model of a cathedral. It was designed to be a cathedral-like train station. And I sort of thought to myself, what would it have been like to set foot in St Pancras Station in the 1850s as a Victorian? What would you have thought? And I think you would have thought two things. First, this reminds me of a cathedral. This reminds me of Westminster Abbey, of Cologne, of all the great of Aachen, and the great cathedrals of Europe. And yet, this enormous structure is housing a machine that can get me to Edinburgh in less than a day.
Yes.
And that sort of integration of the past and the future, as it were, of the energy of our inheritance, harnessed for real progress, and not seeing any tension there, I think is what we should be striving for. You could say that the left, they're always wanting to achieve year zero. They're always wanting to repudiate the past and fetishize what's possible in the future. And you might say that the right tend to be nervous of the future, nervous of the solvent, rightly I think, nervous of the solvent powers of technology on tradition and inheritance and family and so on. But, and tend to elevate the future and through sort of a roseate lens more than they ought to. And I think part of what we want to try and achieve here, I think, is a sort of a posture of openness to the future that doesn't come with a sort of side order of shame about the past.
Yes. Yes, I mean...
It's a very interesting way, because again, you're dealing with eschatology. And eschatology is an area that Christian theology has not really arrived at a consensus for. So, one video I want to make sure that I'm going to put the link in the description. James Orr's conversation with Elizabeth Oldfield, because Elizabeth is not a conservative, but she is a Christian, and we've seen Elizabeth is going to be at the Midwestuary, and so if you come to the Midwestuary, you'll get a chance to meet her. And really her conversation, she's been doing, she's done some conversations with some, let's say, movement conservatives like James Orr and Rod Dreher recently, and which I'm really happy that she's doing that. And this conversation with James Orr was in some ways his Randos conversation, because as Elizabeth so often does, she digs into his story and finds, sort of in the way that Glenn Scrivener described, James sort of comes out of the left and then becomes a movement conservative. And then he makes a comment in there that sort of really stuck with me, because he said, conservatism is only, let's see if I can find it, because it was a good comment.
I should just be thinking about these questions full time.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, one of the things you're really known for is a defender of conservatism. Was that constant? Have you always had that intuition, or was there a moment of coming to it?
As with conservatism itself, you might say, I mean, once upon a time, there was no such thing as conservatism. And conservatism only becomes conscious of itself in kind of Hegelian terms when liberalism comes along, when the normal way of understanding family and nation and church and faith are under attack. And suddenly there's this new kid on the block. But conservatives have not really been the word doesn't really emerge until the 1820s. And I think similarly with me, I didn't really think I don't think a political thought crossed my mind until the Cultural Revolution that broke out in Oxford and Cambridge in 2012, 2013.
That recently?
That recently.
Interesting.
Now, I'm not saying that I suddenly formed these views. I just thought, well, I'm not quite sure what I believe, but it's not that. It's definitely not that. Why isn't it that? There's a kind of, again, another left brain, right brain thing. The left brain was thinking, there's something wrong here. At my gut, I can feel it. But why is it wrong? And so that's what led me to think more deeply about. And there were things, I suppose the church was, all the battles in church over sexuality and so on were a kind of little microcosm of that. And actually, I thought, for all of the neuralgia around those sorts of topics in the church, I actually was quite proud of being Anglican because I thought, we're actually conducting this debate over marriage and what it means in a more morally mature way than the secular world. That where they just rushed it all through, no white paper, no public debate, whatever side of the fence you stand on that issue, huge change in how we understand a building block of community and of the nation. And at least the Church of England's really, wrestling through this and thinking hard about it. And part of the struggle presupposes there's a recognition that this matters. It really does matter. So I suppose it was that was beginning with a kind of progressive, so-called woke, unhelpful term, but easy shorthand. That was really breaking out, I think, in 2013, 2014. I remember a few incidents, putting on events. There was one of debate we did on abortion, or I was helping out with in November 2014, which just blew up because we'd invited the wrong people. We'd only invited men, or I can't remember, and it became a big sort of headline story. And I thought, gosh, there's something really wrong within the university here. So that was happening on the cultural level. Then Brexit was beginning to loom. And I've basically I grew up in Brussels, and as it were, in the belly of the beast. I mean, I knew the European Union inside out. And I've basically been a Brexiteer instinctively since I was 13. And what I noticed immediately, I was in Oxford, I was in Christchurch at the time, which is a sort of grand college, and probably more, in as much as any college leans right. I wouldn't say it leans right exactly, but there were fewer hardcore leftists and progressives in Christchurch. And I noticed that I don't think I met a single colleague who was voting Brexit, but I couldn't find a single Remainer among the staff, the groundsmen, the gardeners, the porters. They were all Brexiteers. It was just this perfect class split on that issue. And then I'd also have colleagues saying, after the vote, democracy's in crisis, and what we need to do is ensure that at least there's some weighting at the ballot box. I think they call it epistocracy. Epistocracy was this idea that was doing the rounds in Oxford, probably still doing the rounds for all I know, where for every educational qualification you have, your vote weighs a little bit more, right? I call it epistocracy. But epistocracy, and I thought to myself, gosh, the arrogance then, why? I would have done it in reverse, right? For every qualification. At the time, that's what I felt like. And so I thought to myself, my gosh, there's a wisdom in, and there are moral intuitions that we should take seriously that are not, that are completely at odds, that I share, that are completely at odds with the dominant orthodoxies. I'm actually going to say groupthink in university circles, in the established elite-forming institutions, and as I discovered in SW1 and London as well. And so I suppose as it were, the tide, you think of the revolution as the tide coming out, and me realizing, looking down and saying, well, actually, I'm wearing conservative trunks. I wasn't really aware of it.
Yeah.
I'm not taking it on, but this is what I believe, and I'm not going to budge. Sorry.
Yeah.
So that's how it's emerged. And I've always since, I've had to refine things a little bit more, but I haven't changed my basic positions. I think.
What would you say the key principles are that are guiding you in that? Like, for someone who's like, I don't really understand what conservatism is, what would you say?
Well, the key principles are principles that, Robert Conquest has this famous law that everybody is conservative about what they know best. Everybody is conservative about what they love most. If you love somebody, I've just been doing Sonnet 116 with my daughter, love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, right? You want to conserve it because you love it. You don't want it to change. You don't want to say, and I think that's the basic impulse. You start from there. Like, there are good theological reasons for it, but there are good secular evolutionary reasons for it. Right? We're finite, we're fallen, we're fragile. You might add another F word in there, in a secular or theological original sin, lapsarian kind of nuance. But we're limited. We're not God, and our affections are limited. Our loves are limited. Would that they weren't, but they are. We're creatures, and so there's a limit to the number of people we can love, the number of institutions we can love, and there's a limit to the kind of concentric circles of political affections and loyalties, which, in my view, basically runs out. It's not perfect, but it basically runs out of the limits of the nation.
Right.
At that point, beyond that, and you might struggle to. It's not nationalism in the sense that it's the weakest form of concrete affection. It's just the point at which it really runs out. Your primary loyalties are going to be to your spouse, to your parents, to your kids, or your neighbours, and that's going to be the difficult. That's going to be a challenge, and that's what you want to conserve. That's what you want to divert your energies to. Maybe your village, your community, your street, and then possibly a city, county, and then really by the time it's getting to the nation or a nested.
Seabax and Luke, this was just released today. I haven't made it my way all the way through it, but good conversation about identity and freedom.
That took over Twitter a few weeks ago with JD Vance and whatnot. And like, I definitely think that there's a reality to that, to commitment related to identity. I don't know, and trust.
Yeah. I think it's a necessary ingredient in identity is a commitment. Or limitation, because I think like what you're talking about with remote work, or even just living in a context where we have infinite options, or it seems like we have infinite options because we're seeing all these people live all these different ways on social media, and we feel like, I could do this, I could do that, I could do this. There's something that feeling of freedom, that lack of constraint, it really destroys meaning in life, because I think it makes it difficult to have a stable identity.
A scaffold, yeah.
A scaffold, yeah, definitely. And that's a thing that I really feel like freedom is kind of antithetical to identity. There's a balance, of course, but I think about all the things that give me identity. It has to do with like kind of constraining myself, restricting myself, either like finding an identity in Christ. That's me trying to conform myself to, God made flesh. To how Christ presented himself. That is essentially constraining. There are certain things that I cannot do. There are certain things that are not Christ-like. It's conforming myself to this image of God made man. But even just, in my marriage, that's obvious as a parent. And then even, Natalie and I have a business, and there's something about owning a business that, you think, I'll be so free. I've set my own schedule.
I'm my own boss.
I'm my own boss. Really, it's like having a child, if you expect to make any money from the business, it comes with a whole list of constraints and obligations, things that just have to do, whether you feel like it or not. But all those things, give me identity and meaning.
I
gotta run. I have constraints on me, and I haven't been around for my men's Bible study for 3 weeks, and the men, I think, are going to be very happy that I'm back. So this was a little messy, a little incoherent, but hopefully I can pull it together with a title and a thumbnail, and it'll make sense. So leave a comment. Let me know what you think.